Hello everyone, welcome to the video lecture series on media skills. This series is produced under the grants provided by Department of Information and Public Relations, Govt of Karnataka in association with Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Karnataka State Akka Women's University, Vijayapura. Today we have with us Professor D.S Poornananda. He will be delivering a lecture on the topic environment journalism. Dr. D.S Poornananda is presently working as a professor at the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Kuvempu University, Shimoga since 2008. He has completed his master's degree in Mysore University and did his MS in Syracuse University, USA. He completed his PhD from Bangalore University with over 34 years of experience in teaching and research. He held different positions at universities, institutions and other organizations. He was a sub-editor with the Times of Deccan English daily published from Bangalore in 1983. He contributed for ISRO sponsored project, a study of Gulbarga television system for rural communication as a research assistant. He worked as a lecturer in the Department of Mass Communication and Journalism, Bangalore University. Communication theory, development communication, environmental communication, film studies are his areas of specialization. He received a fellowship, namely Fulbright Fellow from Syracuse University, New York, USA in 1997. He was a visiting professor for Volda University College, Norway in 2001. He has completed 4 research projects and has published numerous research papers in reputed national and international journals, presented papers in various international conferences and chaired sessions. He played diverse role in administration as a coordinator, secretary, Vishwamangala Education Society, Bangalore, director at Department of Adult Continuing Education and Field Outreach, director student welfare at Kuvempu University, director School of Social Sciences, Kuvempu University and many more. Now I invite Professor D.S Poornananda to deliver a lecture. Thank you.
Welcome to the lecture series on environment and media. There are 4 lectures in the series. This is the first of the 4 lectures, and this is on the growth of environmental concern. This lecture presents an overview of the factors that led to environmental degradation. It also looks at responses to the environmental degradation and the growth of environmental movement and its impact. Now let us look at environmental concern. The term environment, as it is generally understood today, broadly refers to the physical environment that includes animals, plants and their habitats, climate, resources of water, land and air. Environmental concern refers to an attitude towards nature that assumes that human society has the ethical responsibility of preserving the ecological balance and making rational use of all natural resources. Ecological balance means a harmonious coexistence of all forms of life with their environment. Environmentalism is an ideology and a movement aimed at protecting the environment by reducing the human activities on the earth. Environmentalism rejects the idea that man's knowledge of science and technology places him above nature and questions the logic of economic growth as the prime goal of modern society. Ecological balance and sustainable use of resources have been at the center of environmental debate in the last 3-4 decades or so. Let us look at environmental degradation. Environmental degradation is seen generally as a consequence of the industrial revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries. Therefore, there has been a glorification of the pre-industrial past. People supposedly lived in perfect harmony with nature. There is a romantic construction of the society before the industrial revolution. The conception is that everything was so fine, everything was in tune with nature before the industrial revolution happened in the 18th and 19th centuries. But environmental degradation is said to have begun with the development of agriculture around 10,000 years ago. Agriculture has contributed to environmental degradation, including climate change, deforestation, biodiversity loss, soil degradation, etc. Some ancient civilizations like Sumerian civilization, Indus Valley civilization, Greek civilization, Roman Empire, and Mayan civilization, which had flourished for thousands of years, collapsed partly due to ecological factors. Irrigation systems in those civilizations had led to waterlogging, soil degradation, and soil salinity. There was also deforestation and soil erosion. Modern societies do not seem to have learned from the decline of these civilizations. I am reminded of what the German philosopher Hegel famously said: "The only thing that we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history." This is what Hegel said. And that actually brings us to the Green Revolution in India. The Green Revolution in India has made a deep impact on the environment. Scientist and activist Vandana Shiva has written about the harm caused by the Green Revolution in her book titled The Violence of the Green Revolution. She explains with evidence the problems that emerged from irrigation, use of pesticides, fertilizers, and hybrid seeds. So it was violence against nature, and it also led to violence in Punjabi society. So when she says violence, it means both violence that it created in Punjab and also the violence the Green Revolution caused to the earth. The impact of colonialism is also something that we must look into. European colonialism that began with the arrival of Columbus in America in 1492 marked the beginning of the plunder of natural resources. There was a large-scale extraction of natural resources which altered the native ecosystems. Historian Howard Zinn, in his book A People's History of the United States of America, describes the massive ecological destruction caused by the Spanish colonialism in America. As Asian, Latin American, and African countries became European colonies, intensive mining operations began for gold, silver, and diamond. Mountains were razed to the ground. Forests were destroyed. Invasive species and monoculture were introduced, leading to loss of biodiversity. The colonies provided the raw materials for the industries in Europe. In the process of supplying the raw material to the industries in Europe, large-scale destruction of the environment happened. In India too, colonialism caused massive ecological destruction. The colonies became poorer and poorer. There was massive destruction of the environment in India too during the British colonialism. India's share of the world's GDP decreased from 24.4% in 1700 to 4.2% in 1950. This is how the economy of India collapsed during the British colonial rule of over 200 years. Now let us look at rise of environmentalism in Europe, more particularly in England. The Industrial Revolution in England led to unprecedented destruction of the environment. Air pollution, water pollution, soil contamination, habitat destruction became visible. Air pollution was caused by the smoke and emissions generated by burning of fossil fuels. Rivers and lakes were contaminated with the toxins. There was a soil contamination with lead, heavy metals, and toxic chemicals. Habitat destruction led to the extinction of several species of plants and animals. This worried several writers and thinkers of that period. So several writers and thinkers of the 19th century who had witnessed the environmental consequences of the Industrial Revolution in England responded by not only writing about the destruction of nature but also embarking on a program of action aimed at preventing it. Prominent among them were William Wordsworth, John Ruskin, William Morris, and Edward Carpenter. They opposed industrialization and insisted on going back to the land, to the life of peasants and shepherds. They were opposed to railways as they felt it was bringing destruction and disease. Their philosophy and program influenced formation of environmental societies in the late 19th century. Several environmental societies were established in England in the late 19th century, and these societies became very active in questioning the consequences of industrial revolution, and they also had a program of action. They encouraged people to take part in the efforts to reduce the impact of industrialization on the environment. The ideas of Ruskin and Carpenter made a deep impact on young Gandhi, who was a student in England. There is one line environmental ethic of Gandhi: the world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. This statement emphasizes that natural resources should be used only to meet people's needs and not for the luxuries of a few people. He talked about minimum wants and recycling of resources. He often wrote on used paper. In fact, the Hind Swaraj, which has been described as the Gandhian Manifesto of Ecological Living, was written on the used stationery of the ship. He wrote Hind Swaraj on his way back from England to South Africa in 1909. Gandhi was opposed to industrialization as it was predatory in its very nature. He believed that industrialization by nature was very destructive. Although Gandhi did not write explicitly on environment, his ideals have inspired many movements that have raised questions on the environmental consequences of mega industries, big dams, and the destruction of forests. Now let us look at the growth of modern environmental movement. Environmental concern grew into a movement only in the 1960s in the United States and Europe. This happened in the light of new scientific data. There was a lot of data available to show that there was pollution happening and that there was environmental degradation. In June 1962, the New Yorker magazine published in a three-part series the book Silent Spring, written by biologist Rachel Carson. This book has been described as the Bible or the founding event of modern environmentalism. The book popularized the concepts of food chain, ecology, web of life, and balance of nature, and provided a simplified understanding of what is generally referred to as environmental crisis. People were generally unaware of the toxicity of pesticides and their effect on ecological interrelationships until this book was published in 1962. She argued that poisoning earth means poisoning ourselves. According to Rachel Carson, chemicals sprayed on plants and trees enter the human body through the soil, water, and food chain. Carson documented how chemical pesticides such as DDT were poisoning wildlife and contaminating the food chain. Chemicals were sprayed on elm trees. The contaminated leaves that fell on the ground were consumed by the earthworms, and these earthworms were consumed by the robins. Robins are the birds. So they were consumed by the robins. Over a period of time, there was drastic decline in the population of robins. The spring would arrive unheralded by the song of these birds. In fact, silent spring actually meant that when the next spring arrives, there would be no birds to welcome the spring with songs. So it becomes a silent spring. That's the title of her book. Rachel Carson's book led to the banning of DDT and other pesticides. Rachel Carson showed that environmental degradation anywhere would have consequences elsewhere. In that way, it is not that environmental problems happen in only one region and that the other regions are safe. In a way, many environmental problems are global in nature. Stories about pesticides began appearing in media after the publication of The Silent Spring. It was in the early 1970s that environmentalism emerged as a worldwide movement, with several environmental groups becoming active in many countries. The modern environmental movement is said to have begun when the Earth Day was celebrated on April 22, 1970. The growth of the movement led to a realization that collective action at the international level was needed to address the environmental problems. This was the first international conference which looked deep into the environmental issues. This conference, held at Stockholm, brought the attention of the world to the problem of the environment. As the first major conference of the United Nations on environmental issues, it marked a turning point in the development of international environmental politics. The Stockholm Conference led to a fundamental shift in environmental thinking. On June 16, 1972, the United Nations Conference on Human Environment adopted a declaration consisting of a preamble and 26 principles. These principles were adopted to inspire and guide the people of the world in the preservation and enhancement of the human environment. The slogan, "Only One Earth," heralded the beginning of a sense of shared stewardship for the common planetary home. The conference established a United Nations Environment Program to ensure that the world's governments adopted sound environmental management measures. Let us look at the growth of environmental movement, and then the four explanations which have been provided for the growth of environmental movement. Sociologists have given four explanations with regard to the dramatic growth of environmental consciousness and movements in the early 1970s. The first is the reflection hypothesis, which says that environmental movements grew as a direct response to the worsening environmental situation. People who had seen depletion of forest cover and pollution of rivers in North America and Western Europe started questioning industrial development and its consequences on the human environment. The argument here is that in those countries where the environmental deterioration was less obvious, environmentalism appeared to be moderate. But this has been disputed by some scholars. They say that public concern about air pollution had risen at a time when the quantity of pollution had actually declined. So it is not that media report about environmental issues only when they are happening, or people think about environmental issues only when they see them happening. It is possible that the public concern may not be related to actual environmental deterioration. Instead, it may have been shaped by the mass media coverage of the issue. What is perceived as a problem may not reflect reality, but a particular view presented in mass media. So people think that some problem is serious only because it is reported by the mass media. The second explanation is provided through the post-materialist hypothesis, which argues that environmental movements emerged in those countries where material needs of the people had been met. These people had greater interest in ideas, individual autonomy, and quality of the physical environment than in economic progress. The rise in environmental concern reflected a change in values rather than a deterioration in environmental situation. However, the grassroots environmental activism in countries like India, Brazil, Mexico, Thailand, and Nigeria has shown that environmental movements do not happen only in affluent countries. They also happen in poor countries. In fact, in many of the developing countries, environmental movements have been started not by the affluent people, but by the poor people who have lived in their forest for hundreds of years. So this assumption that environmental movement will start only in those countries where the people have met their material needs, is an argument that is not acceptable. The third explanation is the new middle class thesis, which says that environmental ethics are likely to be adopted by those who work in creative or public service oriented professions such as teaching, social work, medicine, journalism, and art. These people of the middle class have time, skills, and resources to participate in the environmental movements. So it is assumed that it's only the middle class which takes part in environmental movements, but Indian experience tells us this is not true, because the Chipko movement was not a movement led by the middle class. The Apiko movement was also not a movement which was led by the middle class. Now the fourth explanation is the political closure hypothesis, which says that environmental movement began rising when environmental issues could not be discussed within the mainstream politics. This kind of political closure led to raising of environmental issues outside mainstream politics. It was civil society organizations that started raising environmental questions, because within the parliament there was no debate taking place, and the governments were bypassing the parliament in signing treaties and agreements with industries and with other countries. So it became essential for the civil society organizations to raise questions on environmental problems. It was very simple that within the political domain, environmental questions would not be asked. So they had to go beyond the political domain and build movements to raise environmental questions. Now, environmental movement in India. Now, contrary to the argument that environmental movements are the phenomena observed only in the post-materialist societies, poor peasants launched a movement in the Himalayan region of India to protect trees in the early 1970s. The Chipko or Hug the Tree movement began 9 months after the first United Nations Conference on Human Environment was held in Stockholm, where India had rejected environmental concern as a Western fad. In fact, Indira Gandhi had made a fiery speech at the conference saying that if pollution meant development, or if development meant more pollution, India would love to have more of it. On March 27, 1973, the peasants of Mandal village in the Alkananda valley of Uttar Pradesh, now Uttarakhand, prevented felling of trees by threatening to hug them. The peasants were outraged when the Uttar Pradesh government allowed a sports goods company to cut down a large number of trees, while at the same time denying them access to trees for making agricultural tools. The direct action of the peasants at Mandal set off protests in several other villages where contractors were prevented from cutting down trees for the external markets. All these protests constituted the Chipko movement. It was the most significant step toward the growth of the environmental movement in India. A significant feature of this movement was that a large number of women took part in it. The peaceful Gandhian methods of protest employed by the Chipko movement became a benchmark for other similar struggles. Anil Agarwal, a Delhi-based journalist who was working with the Hindustan Times, wrote a comprehensive report on the Chipko movement. He later founded the Center for Science and Environment, and also the Down to Earth magazine, the first full-fledged magazine on the environment brought out from India. Bharati struggle is one of the important struggles in the history of environmental movement in India. Far away from the Himalayan region, a struggle by Areca growers in the Uttara Kannada district of Karnataka began in the late 1970s against the proposal to construct a dam across the Bharati river. When the environmental impact assessment of major projects became mandatory in 1978, the proposed hydroelectric project on the Bharati river came up for review. A committee that was appointed to make the impact assessment recommended environmental clearance despite minority protest. Some members of the committee had protested, but still environmental clearance was recommended. Then what did farmers do? Farmers had their own cooperative, and through this cooperative, they carried their own assessment, and they also held a seminar in 1980. This seminar was held to discuss the possible consequences of the project and also to plan a program of action that was necessary to stop the project. Shivram Karanth, a giant literary figure in Karnataka and winner of Jnanapith Award, presided over the seminar, which had representatives from Chipko Andolan and also from Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad. Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad was an organization that had made a significant contribution to popularizing science education in Kerala. The proceedings and resolutions of this first ever public hearing on a development project in India were widely reported in newspapers. The project was ultimately shelved, and then repeated attempts to relaunch the project have failed. So the farmers have succeeded in preventing a dam from coming up across the Bharati river in Uttara Kannada district of Karnataka. Then to continue with environmental movement in India, we'll go to Kerala. In the early 1980s, a movement led by Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad succeeded in stopping the Silent Valley hydroelectric project. The project would have submerged one of the best surviving patches of rainforest in peninsular India. This movement, involving school and college teachers, built up collaboration with wildlife conservationists. And then through this struggle, they succeeded in making an impact on the government. Eventually, in 1983, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi ordered that the project be shelved. And the credit should go to the teachers, activists, and also to the conservationists. This is one of the successful struggles in Kerala in the 1980s. Then Appiko movement. After the success of Appiko movement, organized resistance to the felling of trees emerged in different parts of India. The Appiko or Hug the Tree movement began in Karnataka in 1983, a decade after the Chipko movement had started. The movement, led by activist Panduranga Hegde, began in Sirsi, taluk of Uttara Kannada district in Karnataka. The main objective of the movement was to prevent the felling of trees and the destruction of forests. The Appiko movement launched a program of action with a slogan, Ulisu, which means save, Belesu, which means grow, and Balasu, which means make rational use of the resources. The movement, in fact, succeeded in saving forests in Uttara Kannada district of Karnataka. The late 1980s saw a dramatic increase in the number of environmental groups throughout India. This increase is partly attributed to the awareness created by media coverage of the Bhopal gas tragedy. Bhopal gas tragedy happened in 1984, and another disaster came 2 years later, that was the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. The disaster caused by the leak of lethal gas from the Union Carbide company in Bhopal claimed around 8,000 lives then, and it has claimed many more lives later. More than 500,000 people still suffer from side effects of that exposure. The victims are still fighting for justice. At the time of the Chernobyl disaster, India had begun to see nuclear power as a panacea for its energy crisis. Public protest against such a program of the government began as the Chernobyl accident raised questions about the safety of nuclear power plants, because radioactive clouds were seen after the Chernobyl accident, and over 100 people had also died because of exposure to high level of radiation. So anti-nuclear groups sprang up in many parts of India. They opposed starting of nuclear power projects in India. When the movement against the Kaiga nuclear power plant began in the mid-1980s, students, workers, farmers, writers, film stars, artists, religious leaders, and the village folk took part in protest. There were demonstrations held, debates held at many places, and calls by organizations through the newspapers got hundreds of people to participate in the anti-Kaiga protests. Now, several people from Bangalore and other cities of Karnataka went to the Kaiga village and carried on protests for several days. Protest marches were held in cities, also in small towns, and also in villages. Though the struggle created tremendous awareness and tremendous awareness about the hazards of radiation, it could not prevent the government from going ahead with the project. Although the struggle was carried on for several months, it could not prevent the project from coming up. But it did create a lot of awareness about the environmental consequences of building nuclear power plants. One of the significant movements launched in the late 1980s was the Save the Western Ghats march of 1987-1988. Volunteers representing 150 organizations from Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka, Goa, and Maharashtra took part in it. People walked from both ends of the Ghats and met at Goa after covering the distance of 1,600 kilometers. That was between November 1, 1987 and February 3rd, 1988. They interacted with people in 600 villages and drew their attention to the threatened ecosystem. The march was widely covered by national and international media, with some of them comparing it to Mahatma Gandhi's Salt Satyagraha. Similar marches have taken place in many other districts, but this Save the Western Ghats march remains one of the important marches held for the protection of the environment. So it was a movement that questioned industries that were the proposals to set up industries along the Western Ghats region. Then one of the movements that has remained vibrant for over 3 decades is the Narmada Bachao Andolan. It has been carrying on a campaign against big dams and displacement of lakhs of people in the Narmada valley. This movement which is being led by Meda Patkar, has been a very, very vibrant movement, and it has remained active for over 3 decades. And of late, it has not only raised questions on big dams, but it has raised questions on several issues related to the environment and also livelihoods of tribes and marginalized communities. The 1990s witnessed a strong movement against Mangalore Refineries and Petrochemicals Limited in the Dakshina Kannada district of Karnataka. The laying of the pipeline to release effluents from the plant of MRPL to the Arabian Sea was opposed, as the fishermen feared that the effluents would pose a serious threat to marine life, and these fishermen are dependent on marine life. They felt that their own livelihoods were being threatened by this pipeline. A movement against the proposal to build a thermal power plant at Nandikuru succeeded in stopping the project for some time, but could not prevent the establishment of the thermal power plant in the Udupi district in the later years. The acquisition of land for MRPL and Mangalore Special Economic Zone was resisted by the farmers who lost their sources of livelihood when they were forced out of their homes. Then one of the very important movements that India has seen is the Plachimada movement. This is a very significant movement in the history of environmental struggle in India, because a small village in Palakkad district of Kerala fought against a multinational giant, Coca-Cola company, and succeeded in its struggle. The cola plant at the Plachimada village had caused depletion of a water table and also contamination of water. It had also distributed toxic waste as fertilizer to the farmers who were living around the plant. Then a World Water Conference was held in 2004. The World Water Conference, which was held at the Plachimada, was attended by many environmentalists, including Vandana Shiva. Lot of people took part in the water conference. Then a very, very active movement was built up later. So they brought pressure on the company to relook at what they had been doing, and the panchayat also went to the Supreme Court against the Coca-Cola company. And the Mathrubhumi newspaper played a key role in the movement. So ultimately, the Coca-Cola plant at Plachimada village was closed down. Probably it was the first time in the history of environmental struggle that a big company like Coca-Cola was closed down because of the struggle carried on by a village panchayat, and of course supported by environmentalists and a newspaper like Mathrubhumi. Then protests against Kudankulam nuclear power plant began in 2011 in the wake of Fukushima disaster in 2011. The anti-nuclear movement had begun in Tamil Nadu when a proposal to build a nuclear power plant at Kudankulam with the assistance of the Soviet Union was announced in 1988. The construction work of the project, which was in limbo for many years because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, later began to be built. Because of the struggle put up by the people who were living around Kudankulam, there was a lot of media attention paid to it. In fact, Kudankulam struggle became an internationally known struggle. 1,800 protesters were arrested, with some of them being charged with sedition. Despite protest, the plant went critical in 2013. Now, Kudankulam, nuclear power plant is actually functioning despite people's struggle against it for many years. India's diversity is reflected in the environmental movement. There are different ideological streams in the Indian environmental movement. There are Gandhians, there are Marxists, and there are also appropriate technologies. But all of them emphasize the importance of participatory democracy, decentralized political power, and grassroots-based political advocacy. Now let us look at measures that were taken because of the environmental movement, and also because of the realization on the part of the government that environment was an issue to be addressed seriously. One of the first measures was to bring in Wildlife Protection Act in 1972. This act contains very stringent clauses, stringent sections which award punishment to the people who harm wildlife. Many people say that all of wildlife in this country has been saved because of this act. Otherwise, many of the species would have become extinct by now. Then Project Tiger came in 1973, and this project has saved tigers in India. In fact, the tiger population has increased in the recent years. There are now 9 tiger reserves. Then in 1974 came Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act. This helped prevention of water bodies and rivers and other sources of water. Then interestingly, the 4th 5-year plan in 1975 talked about protection of environment and also responsibility of the government in protecting the forest. It was for the first time that the planning commission's document talked about the need to protect environment. Then in 1976, a constitutional amendment was made to include Article 48A and 51G. These two articles place obligation on the state and the citizen to protect the environment. Article 48A talks about the responsibility of the state in protecting the environment, and Article 51G talks about the responsibility of the citizens in protecting the environment. So these clauses were important clauses from the point of view of creating an awareness among the people about their responsibility towards conserving environment. Then some more measures for environmental protection. The Forest Conservation Act was made in 1980, and it is said that it is this act which has actually saved lakhs and lakhs of hectares of forest in India. But for this act in 1980, India would have lost large expanse of forests. Then in 1980, the government of India set up Department of Environment. This was the first institutional establishment to address the issue of the environment. Then came the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1981. This was also an important act because until then there was no formal act that would make some prescriptions with regard to air pollution. And another important development was the setting up of Center for Ecological Sciences at Indian Institute of Science in Bengaluru. So this Center for Ecological Sciences at Indian Institute of Science at Bangalore, was headed by Madhava Gadgil, a well-known ecologist, and this center has carried on several studies on the Western Ghats or on the ecology of Western Ghats. Then the Ministry of Environment and Forests was created in 1985. In 1980, the Department of Environment was created, and in 1985, Ministry of Environment and Forests was created. And now it is Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change, which shows that the government considers climate change as a serious issue today. Ministry's clearance was made mandatory for all major industries. So this ministry plays an important role in assessing the environmental impact and then clearing the projects. Then in 1986 came one of the very comprehensive and significant legislations, and this was Environment Protection Act of 1986. This act made public hearing compulsory for all major projects. So people had to be heard before the projects were to be built. And also, it also made environmental impact assessment compulsory. Then rules with regard to environmental impact assessment came in 1994. In fact, some months ago or last year, there was an attempt to make amendments to the clauses with regard to environmental impact assessment, but there was very strong resistance by environmentalists and activists against amending the environmental impact assessment procedures. Then came National Forest Policy in 1988, a comprehensive one, which actually helped in evolving a strategy to save forests and to use forest resources responsibly. Then came in 2002 Biodiversity Act. This Biodiversity Act came as a result of the resolutions adopted at the Rio Summit in 1992. The Rio Summit had stressed on the need to prevent biodiversity loss, and this convention on biodiversity was signed by several countries in June itself, in June 1992. Then there are some books for reference on the topics that we have discussed so far. There is a book by John Bellamy Foster, The Vulnerable Planet, a short economic history of the environment. This book gives a broad overview of how environmental degradation happened and what were the factors that contributed to environmental degradation in the ancient times, in the medieval times, and also in the present times. There is a book by Ramachandra Guha. Ramachandra Guha is an environmental historian and also biographer of Gandhi. It was Ramachandra Guha who wrote a book on Chipko movement, and this was titled Unquiet Woods, Ecological Change and Peasant Resistance in the Himalaya. And then Ramachandra Guha has written one more book, Environmentalism, A Global History. This book presents how the environmental consciousness grew in UK, in Europe, and other parts of the country, and it also introduces to a lot of concepts related to environment and development. Then there is a book by Daryl DeMonte. The book is titled Temples or Tombs, Industry versus Environment, Three Controversies. And this book presents these controversies to us. There are a lot of insights that we can get from this particular book. Then there is a book by Akka Acharya and Frederick Narona. They have edited this book. There are articles written by activists and journalists. It's called The Green Pen, Environmental Journalism in India and South Asia. This particular book has a chapter written by Panduranga Hegde on the Apiko movement in Uttarakhand district of Karnataka. There is a book edited by or written together, not edited, written together by Madhav Gadgil and Ramachandra Guha. This book is Ecology and Equity. This provides a lot of background to the environmental problem in India. And there is a book by Hannigan. The title of the book is Environmental Sociology, a Social Constructionist Perspective. This also has a chapter on how media began covering environmental issues, and this book also provides the four explanations that I talked about in the beginning, four explanations with regard to how the environmental movement dramatically began in the 1960s and early 1970s. This is the end of this lecture. In the next lecture, we'll talk about media and the environmental agenda. Thank you very much.